Welcome everyone to today's webinar, The Business of Total Joints at Surgery Centers. I am Brian Zimmerman, Custom Content Editor with Becker's Healthcare. We'll begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenter, Nader Samy. As Chief Executive Officer of National Medical, has guided the company into its position as the largest and most reputable revenue cycle management company in the ASC market. Nader leads the company's strategic direction with a strong emphasis on exceptional client services, lean and efficient processes, cutting-edge technologies, and insightful analytics. Prior to National Medical Billing Services, Nader was the co-founder and president of Ajuba International, a leading healthcare revenue cycle outsourcing company that was created in 2001 and grew to approximately 2,000 employees by 2009. Prior to Ajuba, Nader was an investment banker at both Merrill Lynch and Dillon Read & Company, now UBS Securities, and also served as a corporate finance attorney at the 400-member law firm of Dykema Gossett. His business experience and understanding of the ASC market has created deep consultative ties with our clients. Nader is currently a member of the Public Affairs Committee for the Ambulatory Surgery Center Association, as well as an active member of the Healthcare Financial Management Association. Nader has a BBA, BA in Finance Economics from the University of Notre Dame, where he played on the men's varsity tennis team, and he has a JD MBA from the University of Wisconsin. At this time, I am pleased to turn the floor over to Nader to begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Brian. Really appreciate it. I am really looking forward to talking about all things total joints from a business perspective today. We will obviously have Q&A at the end of this, with this format at the end, and so I look forward to answering any and all questions. And to the extent we don't get to them all at the end, happy to follow up either live or respond to the questions after that. But from where we sit, this is one of the more interesting, exciting developments from I think clinically as well as from a business standpoint as it relates to surgery centers. And we're going to again kind of talk about all of that with much more of a focus on the business than the clinical today. From the standpoint of trends that are really driving this movement from total joints, there's obviously been a big emphasis on knees recently, but all total joints, it's really first and foremost are economics and convenience. And it's rare in life that you get into a position where the three main constituents all can win in this scenario. And in this case, that is exactly what we're facing and what we're looking at, which I think is really a big part of that opportunity and what's going to move it so quickly. So from the standpoint of the first constituent, the most important, the patient, from their standpoint, it is a low-cost environment, so significantly lower cost in almost all cases. Obviously, you need to make sure you review your benefits and understand what you'd be paying if you went inpatient versus hospital outpatient versus in an ASC. But in almost all cases, you'll find that you're going to save significant money. But as or more importantly, it's extremely convenient. You've got highly personalized attention. There's, many studies have shown infection rates are lower in this setting because you're in a situation where you typically, there are not sick patients in the ASC. So when you're going in for a total joint, you've got that wonderful, scenario, and you've also got a very cutting edge center that's been built and designed to do that. So combination of low cost and just for all the other reasons, very convenient. On a personal level, I actually had surgery about 1.5 years ago. It wasn't a total joint, but it was a major procedure in the spine arena, and I went through that process, and I'll talk about it a little bit here. But it was a tremendous experience, wonderful personalized attention. It was an overnight stay for me, and in that situation, it was myself, and 2 nurses, and that was it. So it was great care, and wonderful experience from that standpoint. So I've seen it firsthand of how it can really, be beneficial. From a surgeon's perspective, similar also in the sense of scheduling their surgeries significantly, faster and easier to get in from a scheduling perspective. They typically are in a position to control the staffing more, and they can build a team of total joint experts that maybe they've recruited over from their past experience over the years at the health system. So they're not getting just who's assigned to them, but they've got their kind of dream team from that perspective. They also are in a position to influence the technologies, the implants and such that are purchased for the centers that they're working in, and so they can use what they want, how they want, when they want, and so that's a huge benefit from the surgeon perspective. On top of that, and importantly, they are now sharing in the economics of the facility fee. So in the hospital, they're getting their professional fee. They're not getting any part of that, obviously, the economics going to the hospital. And in this case, as typically, the vast majority of the surgeries being performed in ASCs do have physician ownership, and those particular shareholders are surgeons, and so that is a nice little other benefit from that perspective. And from a payer perspective, clearly, again, lower cost setting. From a Medicare standpoint, you typically look at 60 cents on the dollar relative to what's hospital inpatient. I think that's probably pretty similar if you look across the board for total joints from when you're kind of looking at the rate that they're paying. So significant cost savings, and also providing a great service to their members, allowing them to go there. So again, these 3 main constituents all are driven and motivated to move more and more of these types of procedures and these significant procedures into the ASC setting. And then finally, from the economics perspective, as we all know, bundle payments are coming. They're here and are coming. I'm not sure I'd say fast and furious, but they're definitely coming, and it's a big part of the evolution of reimbursement. And so given that context too, it's also another driver you're looking to manage and reduce costs for, you're going to have the same fee that you're getting, and if you can do that in a lower cost setting, of the surgery center, and be able to manage, readmissions, manage, PT, rehab, those types of things, it becomes significantly more beneficial financially as well. Of course, the aging population, total joints are, as we all age, becomes much more important. You'll see on a slide that we're going to get to, showing the trends and the growth of the number of total joints, regardless of the site of service, that are coming, and driven heavily by combination of the aging population and technological advancements. The technological advancements are putting us in a position where surgeries can be performed and people can regain that quality of life, whether it's a knee that they couldn't really perform on, whether it's just day-to-day walking around or athletically, a hip, shoulder, whatever it is. Now you're in a position where the technology has really increased the number of people that are able to have those types of procedures, and and to do so with minimized pain, and the outcomes have been tremendous. Again, total joints starting in the inpatient, moving to hospital outpatient, and now with the reasonable amount of volume that have happened in the ASC, any studies, and sort of anecdotally, all the clients we have and the surgeons we talk to who are performing these cases in the ASC, now they've been very careful clinically to take the right patients and to do, take all the right steps to ensure success, and that they're following, from a safety perspective. But the results have been amazing. And, we hear, example after example of, 75-year-old patients going in for a total knee and, going home before lunchtime on that day, 3 to 4 hour type stays. And finally, just this week, I'm sure everyone is aware that CMS has put on their proposed ruling. It was a discussion. They had moved the knees off the hospital inpatient, but hadn't moved it to the ASC approved payable list, and now they just proposed that to go onto the ASC payable list, which obviously is a significant development in this space to be determined. One, if it gets passed, two, what the reimbursement will be and such. We'll get into that in a little bit more depth, but clearly will be a driver of, again, if set up correctly and CMS handles it from a reimbursement and process standpoint correctly, significant driver of additional volume moving. As I've just kind of talked about the projected growth, so just talking, for example, from a hip and knee joint replacement today, there are about 900,000 being performed today. That number is projected for a lot of the reasons that I just mentioned, aging population, technology, to double in the next 7 years, double. And then when you look at that, today 15% only of those procedures are being performed in an outpatient setting, and that number is looking to be 50 to 52% in that range by 2026. So again, 7 years, you're going to go from only 15% to half of these being performed outpatient. So if you kind of look at those numbers, the hospital outpatient numbers will go from 200,000 today to 900,000 in that 2026. That's a 4.5 times increase. And again, we're talking from a business standpoint. How many times do you look at a business that you're doing, that you're handling, that you're looking at today that is projected to grow at almost 5 times in volume in the next 7 years? And if you do the math on that, 900,000 cases of total joints being performed in an ASC, when you're talking about kind of market size and what you're looking at from an opportunity, just from a business standpoint, that's $13.5 billion of reimbursement for just total hips and knees. Just total hips and knees, $13.5 billion being performed in that ASC setting within 7 years of now. So if you're developing and building the total joint business today, it's obviously you're on the right path, and I would encourage you to continue focusing and looking and investing further in there. And if you aren't, obviously it's something that if it makes sense for you guys clinically, then it is, again, very, very big. I was talking about earlier, one of the bigger opportunities and exciting kind of changes we've seen in the industry in a long time. And again, if you look at it when talked about from the payer's perspective, that movement, that projected movement will save Medicare $2.5 billion and overall commercial payers $38 billion. So incredible numbers from that standpoint. We get questions, so as you're going down this path, reimbursement. What are the issues? What are the trends? What should we expect? It's one, I'll say it's all over the board. Again, we're in the nascent stages of this industry, and so making sure you understand your market, your costs, your competitors, and what's going on nationally is extremely important, because this will set the stage for whether you're going to be able to, on a long-term basis, be able to do total joints and afford to do them in the ASC, and hopefully do them in a way that really drives some cash flow, to your surgery center. But if you look at, and again, we don't need to go into all the numbers on this slide, but this is just an example of 6 different payers. And what you'll see in the different contracts is the implants are all handled differently, by different payers per your contract. And so sometimes that implant is included in the overall rate. Sometimes it's excluded but paid for separately. And when it's paid for separately, sometimes it's just at cost, sometimes it's cost plus some percentage, sometimes it's the percentage of bill charge. So you need to really understand that. But I guess the point here is you have wide-ranging numbers. You see knees anywhere from $7,300, carving out an implant, and let's make that implant $4,500 to $5,000. So you're looking at about, let's call it $12,000, and others in here that are paying, $26,000 for fundamentally the same procedure. So your ability to negotiate that and to do that wisely and smartly is really important. I would also say, and we'll get into the managed care contracts part a little bit later here, but I would also say if you haven't done it, or if you're at the stages of doing it, I would encourage doing it sooner rather than later, given the most recent announcement from CMS, because once they establish a rate, which is unclear, we have a sense as to where we think that will fall out, but establishing your rate and negotiating that now before Medicare creates the floor, at which, of course, we know everyone is going to look at and utilize, certainly from a negotiation perspective on their end, I would encourage that. So jumping to the next slide in terms of Medicare, and again, it's a very interesting timing given the webinar and the ruling that just, the proposed ruling that was just added. So kind of going back, for 2018, CMS removed the total knee and shoulder procedures from the inpatient only list, but did not. They took them off inpatient only. So now you could do it in a hospital outpatient department, but did not add them to the ASC approved list. And then just this week, CMS obviously made this proposal, which honestly I think surprised a lot of people. I think everyone knew it was coming, but thought it might be another year out. And so, CMS has proposed putting the total knees on the ASC approved list, and also moving total hip replacements off the inpatient only list. So the total hips are following the same process, feeling like they're about a year behind the knees from a CMS standpoint. So anticipate reasonable chance, assuming that there's good studies and good test cases, and all evidence we've seen are the hips are going wonderfully in the ASC setting. And so again, big development. I think we're all watching anxiously. They threw out a few numbers in that proposed ruling that gave you a feel for where the what the hospital outpatient department numbers look like for those total knees. And I don't want to predict a number, but I would say it feels like it's maybe a floor in the mid 9s to a cap around 12,000, somewhere in there, which would of course include the implant. So everyone is going to be watching that really closely, because if that number gets too low, and we're going to get into some cost numbers, picking a few different examples that we have good information on. If that number gets too low and it sort of eliminates the profitability and makes it not worth the effort, the time, effort, and initiative from surgery center's perspective, if that happens, then it's going to really not achieve the purpose. I think that CMS is trying, with this movement to create that opportunity and to move more of these cases in the low-cost setting. But if they go too far, it's actually not going to accomplish that, because no one's going to do that. So we're all watching that closely, and I guess everyone's got a different view on what that number needs to be based on their cost structure as to what would make them decide to do or not do a case in the ASC. And then the second part of that is, based on what that number is, obviously that can affect the commercial payments. If you were used to getting $22,000 for a total joint, including implant, and Medicare sets the number at $9,500, over time, most likely those commercial carriers are going to start to, look at that, and it could bring down the overall, rates for the industry. So it's a little bit of a good and bad situation. And again, I guess we will all continue to, stay alert and pay close attention to what happens, here. On the obvious, I guess, but really critical point here, though, is the volume would significantly spike. This shows here 48% of Medicare total knees occurred without complications on patients 80 or younger. So significant amount of the Medicare population, we believe, hard to give an exact number, but, in that number looks like sort of half would be able to move over and have these surgeries done in an ASC. So again, big volume opportunity. How that plays out relative to prices is to be determined. So this next slide here, again, it's focused here on the knees. Would it be viable in an ASC? So what this is essentially showing on the far left as you move forward, what's the inpatient, what's the hospital outpatient rate, and then what in the ASC, so a total risk that's approved in an ASC is about 19% below the hospital outpatient. A total elbow was priced about 23%, and a uni knee was priced about 27% below. So with the total knee in the hospital outpatient at $10,123, if we see that kind of a decline, a 20+% drop into the ASC pricing, it will be problematic. Our assumption is it will actually end up being higher than that, but we will all see soon enough. From a bundled payment, jumping ahead here to bundled payments, not going to spend a lot of time on this. I think everyone is familiar with the concept, and it's coming. It's maybe more prevalent today in the hospital environment than it is in the ASC environment, but it is absolutely here in some smaller percentage volume today and growing. But I think it's a overall positive driver from a surgery perspective. There's work to be done for everyone to make sure they really understand their numbers and they can work with the different players to understand who's going to get paid what. But fastest growing payment type, it's going to be 17% of all medical payment types in the next few years. And again, overall big picture, a driver of additional business to ASCs if people are capped on what their reimbursement is going to be. So again, there's significant detail, and that's sort of worthy of its own webinar from that standpoint, but it really is something to keep an eye on. It also, there's another part of this too, which we'll kind of get into when we get into the contracts, but with the implant costs that people have, we've seen in the past, people might not necessarily be honed in on the cost of their implant if they're used to getting it reimbursed at cost or cost plus 5%. But when it starts to get bundled in from a Medicare perspective, as we talked about in maybe some of their other contracts, or you've got, a bigger bundled payment structure, it's going to be interesting to see the dynamic with surgery centers and the implant companies from a negotiation on cost standpoint, because obviously any dollar, once you get away from it being paid at cost, any dollar cost savings that you negotiate in that case drops to the bottom line for surgery centers. So will be another sort of interesting development to observe over time. As we jump into, again, I don't want to spend a lot of time clinically today, but what I will say is the main initiatives that or factors that surgeons and surgery centers are looking at in making a decision clinically to decide whether a case should be performed in an ASC or is eligible for an ASC is what is their medical condition? I would say typically kind of a middle-aged, non-obese, relatively healthy person, no significant medical conditions, BMI, 35 below. Some people use 40 or below, and don't have any other sort of chronic health issues are typically your perfect candidates to have these cases performed there. So that decision and that process really starts with the surgeon and the surgeon's office as to whether this person is a viable candidate. Secondly, even to kind of go down this path, the surgeons would have needed to, and the ASCs would have needed to go through a pretty detailed process to make sure that, again, clinically they are set up properly. They've got the right safety precautions. One, they're identifying the proper patients. Two, they've got all the proper safety precautions. Three, they have the right staff. Four, they have the right technology, test a couple cases, et cetera. So once they've gone through all of that, then they're really ready to be able to perform cases there from a clinical perspective. And that's about all I'll say clinically. I'm not a doctor, and so I kind of leave it at that. But those are obviously important factors to be addressed by the surgeons and the surgery centers as you get there. And then once you've made that decision, that now you're getting into the business side. And one of the things we always talk to our clients about is saying as much time and effort as you spent clinically to make the decision as to do this and to how to do it and to do it right, you need to give that same effort and initiative to the business side of this, because these are significant dollars. They're significant expenses, and they're significant dollars from a reimbursement standpoint coming into your center if you handle it right from a business standpoint. If you don't, you've gone through all this time, effort, money, and hard costs too, implants and other expenses. And if you're not going to get reimbursed or reimbursed properly, then it's going to be not just a losing proposition, but a painful losing proposition, because you're losing much bigger dollars than you were before if you don't handle it correctly. So the first thing is, from a managed care contract standpoint, really important. We've kind of talked about the reimbursement, but negotiating contracts, understanding the landscape and what the landscape looks like, and again, what your cost structure looks like, factoring in everything, factoring in your implants, factoring in your drug costs, factoring in your staff, your overhead, the opportunity cost of not doing other cases. So looking at all of those components to decide and understand where you really feel like you should be, and also understanding the inpatient cost structure. What are the hospitals charging locally? If that's the main competition, inpatient or hospital outpatient, if that's how they're doing, because as you're going to sit there and talk with payers, obviously one of the big part of this is what's their cost savings. So they're not necessarily concerned about what your revenue and your profitability is going to be, but they definitely are very concerned and interested in what their cost savings would be. And so as you sit down with them with all of that type of data, you're in the best position to negotiate the best rates for yourself. And again, we've talked about the implants, but again, I just want to emphasize this because it's such a big deal. And again, now if all the implants are going to be bundled with Medicare, so one, understanding, some ASCs we see have, a single vendor type policy where they can negotiate the best rates based on volume. Other centers want their surgeons to be able to use what they're comfortable with and what they like, and continue to stay educated on the latest trends from all the different vendors who will then compete against each other. Both are fine. Both are just dependent on your preference. Obviously, one may get you a little bit better rate than the other, but understanding your rates, knowing that your reimbursement is going to be, especially in Medicare and with these other payers, it's going to be capped. Also understanding how the individual contracts read. So some of them will have global period language. Some of them will have, again, different ways that you need to bill it appropriately, et cetera. So your billing team needs to really understand what's in the contract as well. From a front desk standpoint, also really important to make sure that everything has been handled correctly here. I've got friends who've kind of gone through these cases in surgery centers, and they went through everything and they got a pre-auth. They did everything right. They paid their patient deductible. They paid their copay. They paid everything they were supposed to pay. And then it comes back later that they will, pushing it back to the patient saying, they told us you had a pre-auth that you either didn't need a pre-auth or they gave you one, but now they're not honoring it. And so now the patient owes $30,000, $40,000. So making sure that all of those steps are handled correctly from a front desk process standpoint. Otherwise, you may have a beautiful clinical experience for your patient, but if the billing process and all the communication there falls, and now you're starting to send patients big bills when they shouldn't be getting those, all of a sudden your patient satisfaction rates plummet. So very important to make sure that, one, you've checked the box with the surgeons and the surgical office has done everything to make sure that the pre-surgery requirements were met, and that they're the right person and they qualify to have this case done in an ASC, that you got a pre-auth, if the payer, and make sure you get that in writing and you document and you track it well, get a range of codes too, because it might end up being a little bit different than what you thought you were going to get, identify the correct insurance, really understand the medical policies from the payer, and then have a comprehensive registration packet that provides all the information. I've also seen situations where later you're having to reach out to the patient, have them fill out forms and approvals so that you can appeal on their behalf. It's just a nuisance from a patient standpoint. Again, terrible from the patient experience and the patient relationship standpoint. So really think through all that. And patient financial counselors / educators are really important, both at the surgical office as well as at the ASC. And in the surgical office, the opportunity to sit down with the patient, I've seen the conversations be where the surgeon just turns to the patient and says, do you want to have this procedure done in a surgery center or in the hospital? And that's it. Just leave it to the patient to decide. Well, they don't really know. So having brochures that explain, the pros and cons of the different settings, having someone sit down and explain to them and say, hey, I've looked at your benefits. It'll cost you $2,000 to do this in ASC. It's going to cost you $5,000 in a hospital. And here's some of the other reasons why our other patients like it. I think that is, as I look across the ASC landscape, I feel like that is a missing piece happening, from the standpoint of in the surgical offices. I think it doesn't happen nearly enough. And I firmly believe that is a big driver of, one, making a patient feel good, that someone's talking to them, educating them, and two, it's natural if they're educated on those options, more and more people will choose a surgery center setting over going to a hospital inpatient. I personally would, and most folks I know would. So, anyways, that's that front desk and managed care contracting. Those two things really set the stage for your success in the total joints arena. And then from a coding perspective, you've got, making sure you select, the proper, CPT codes, having your charge master be correct and utilize that properly. Having specific invoices for each implant is really important. Some payers require it, to be submitted at the time of claim. Some might follow up later from an appeal standpoint, but having a good organized process and understanding, again, how each of your contracts read. And again, as you're billing, is this one that shipping's included? Do you need to, are you billing at whatever percent cost plus 5%? Make sure you're doing that right, because again, you're going to get denials on implants. And again, if you're talking a $15,000 to $20,000 reimbursement and the implant's $4,500 to $5,000, you're looking at 25 to 30% of your overall reimbursement being those implants that you've already paid for. So making sure you're not leaving those dollars on the table really, really important. And then just kind of claims, payments, and follow-up. Some of the areas that we see where people are challenged or maybe make mistakes and leave some money on the table is same. We kind of talked about if that payer needs a copy of the invoice, do they want it uploaded to their payer portal? Do you have to submit it electronically and then submit the invoice separately? Do you have to drop the whole claim to paper? Every payer has their own different requirements, and so really understanding that and making sure you're doing that so you're getting paid efficiently, less follow-up on the back end, but if there is follow-up, know the why and be able to make sure that you can close that loop. And one of the things we'll also see is a lot of times, with the payment posting, people lumping payments into one line instead of posting by line item. Those are things that, again, make it really difficult when you're kind of going back later to track the financial success and have integrity in the data. It's really important that all be handled correctly. And finally, these big ticket items, and this applies whether it's total joints and that you've got implants or even in other specialties, large ticket items, have a process where you're tracking the zero paid implants. So again, nothing's being left on the table. And really, I would say periodically, most people aren't doing so many of these that you couldn't, at the end of every month or at the end of every quarter, depending on how you're set up, do an audit of the process. Make sure you're coding it correctly. Make sure everything's happened at each step. Because if you're making some mistakes along the way, it's a great way to catch and fix on a global level and make sure that none of these big ticket items are left out there. So the next slide, moving into, talked about obviously why total joints might move from a clinical perspective, from a business perspective, the trends, well, the financial impact. So this is just a case study here to demonstrate how much, if you attack this, correctly and you're doing it right, from servicing the patients well, the surgeons are happy, the payers are happy, what kind of financial impact it can have on your surgery center. So you kind of look here on the left, we've got an example. This is a sample multi-specialty ASC that does 300 cases a month and averages 2,000 cash per case. So pretty kind of normal multi-specialty mix center. So they're generating $600,000 a month, which is $7.2 million annually, and operating at a 20% EBITDA margin. So they're making, $1.4 million a year of EBITDA or cash flow, and on their $7.2 million. So there's different ranges, and we'll kind of get into this in a minute as to what multiples you might apply to a business like this. But 8 times, I think, is a fair multiple, and again, we use that for this example. So that business, as it stood, would be worth $11.5 million. Great. Now, dropping below there, taking that exact same center, adding 15 total joint cases per month, just 15, at a cash per case, we took an average. Maybe this will come down a little bit, but today, about $18,000, including the implant. And that drives an additional $270,000. So a little less than 50% of additional revenue by adding 5% more cases from the standpoint of your overall volume, but obviously high reimbursement cases. Well, these are, what we've seen is profitability of these things are 50, 60, and even 70%. So conservatively using 50% as a profit margin on these cases, that $270,000 of revenue is driving $135,000 to your bottom line. Now remember, on your 300 cases, you were making $120,000 a month. You just added $135,000 by adding 15 key cases per month. And so as that adds at $1.6 million, I've, again, taken a conservative approach of not even changing the multiple. Now, just to be clear, if this is what you did in your center, your multiple, if it was 8, would go up, because now you're showing a higher growth rate and a higher profitability significantly. So if it was 8, it's probably 11 or 12. But for conservative basis took an 8 times multiple of that EBITDA increase, and that business that yesterday was worth $11.5 million is now worth $24.5 million. So again, you have more than doubled the value of your center by adding 15 of these types of cases. So again, obviously, as you add more of those, that only goes up. And again, I think it goes up even more than this just by, frankly, it being a better, healthier, higher growth, higher margin profiled business. So if I'm sitting in the shoes of a surgery center, I'm looking at these types of opportunities. Again, it needs to make sense clinically and from a patient perspective, but if it does, there are few and far between business opportunities like this. And again, remember way back to the beginning slide when I talked about $13.5 billion of revenue moving over the next 7+ years to ASCs with only total knees and hips. That's it, just total knees and hips. So taking this example, just kind of going a little bit deeper, here are some of the assumptions we used, and these are very real numbers from a very real center, nameless, but the cost per case, approximately $5,000 for the device, for the implant. And again, we see $4,000 to $6,000. This is a total knee. Drug costs $450, basic supply costs another $900, and staffing $500. So you're looking at a total case cost of under $7,000, so $6,700. And if you're generating $18,000, $20,000, $22,000, obviously you're looking at 60+% margins. Very powerful. I think these numbers are really interesting to look at as you start to think about what's going on with Medicare. Is Medicare going to come in at $9,500? So if they come in at $9,500, or let's say $10,000, your costs are $6,700. You're still looking at a decent profitable margin there, but not nearly what it was. And so these become the business decisions that everyone individually has to make for themselves. And obviously, I think we're all hoping Medicare doesn't go too low to disincentivize the movement of these cases to the most logical place that they should be done, wherever that is, wherever that set of service is based on the patient and the reimbursement and such. So it was just keeping that in mind. The next slide shows that, in just kind of that next step of that, really what I just talked about there. So $7,000-8,000, I think that will be too low. If you just took it that 20-25% discount like they have from hospital outpatient to the ASC setting would get you in that range. Again, our gut from what we see and kind of ears to the ground feel like it will be higher than that. And then it's just really an individual decision. The other part of this is it really will, I think, and I think it's incumbent upon surgery centers now, knowing that this is coming, to look at their costs and understand, are there ways to lower that cost setting at all to put themselves in position to take advantage of Medicare at almost whatever number they come in at. Can you bring your cost down by $1,500 from that $6,700 in that example? Get yourself to low fives. Now you probably can do pretty well still, if in that case. So this is taking another example of a surgery center we know well and just showing the impact that they're just, again, to show this is very real. Their first year of operations, for not first year of operations for the center, first year of doing total joints, hips and knees in an ASC. So if you'll see here, about 43 hips and 80 knees. And by the way, we see that as a pretty consistent ratio across the board, kind of 2-to-1 knees to hips, from the standpoint of the kinds of surgeries that are being done, and then shoulders would be much less than that. So total revenue on those 123 cases, 2.3 million. They spent $830 a million, $1.5 million to the bottom line in that 1 year period. So the numbers we talked about on the prior examples and the case study and that financial impact and the impact on your EBITDA and thus on your net worth, their equity value of your organization, they're very real. These are real numbers that demonstrate that example. And as we kind of get closer to the end here, I did want to talk about just briefly, historically, orthopedic practices and ASCs have been very strong cash flowing organizations, and as a result have been really very independent. So I would say relative to most specialties, orthopedics operate on their own, remain independent, are successful, and thrive, and are in position to continue doing so. At the same time, if you look at when they look to either exit, sell part of, or sell all of, it has been heavily to health systems, sometimes to management companies, and those are both legitimate and viable options. But what has become a new and viable financial option or strategic partnership type option is private equity. And we've seen a lot of private equity investment in the past in different specialties, a lot of single specialties like pain management, ophthalmology, dermatology, some of the other hospital-based specialties, but really not in orthopedics. But that's changing. And, some of the reasons why private equity guys are coming here is, one, they love cash flowing businesses. And so cash flowing businesses and ones that have a growth profile are perfect from their standpoint. And if you look at orthopedics, all of the trends we've talked about here are significant, create significant growth opportunities for the industry, and they're profitable. These are big ticket items. They're profitable. They're really not controversial. There's not significant regulatory concerns like you might have, for example, in pain management and overuse of pain medications or injections. Orthopedics is really pretty clean with respect to all of those issues. So you've got an aging population. You've got these big ticket items moving to the surgery centers where these orthopedic groups can benefit from it financially. You've got the bundle payment movement coming, and again, driving these things to these big procedures to lower cost setting. And then all of the ancillary services you typically see orthopedic groups have all really help that. And private equity loves those other lines of businesses that can take the core patient base that they have and drive additional revenue and cash flow through imaging, PT, DME, et cetera, and of course ASCs. And what we're seeing now is orthopedic surgeons are now starting to say, hey, as we're getting later in our career, instead of just retiring, I've made nice, good cash flow, and I'll just hand over my shares to somebody else and get a few $1,000s on the way out. They're looking at this industry that has some smart investment folks that are looking at it. The multiples are pretty high from an EBITDA standpoint. The presentation, if you're a private equity firm talking to orthopedic groups, is you're looking at them saying, hey, you can build an empire here. You've built this great business. We can give you capital to invest in even the latest, the even better technology and the latest and greatest to really be cutting edge in your business. We can help with you guys, give capital to recruit more surgeons, and we can potentially help you with acquisitions and joint ventures and thinking about how to really build the business. So they may go sell 60% of it, still own 40%, and have an opportunity to, one, take some chips off the table financially today and tomorrow, still own 40%. And if that growth happens the way that everyone, as they come together, want it to, sometimes they end up making more on that next 30 or 40% ownership than they made on the first sale. So all indications are that there is a flurry of activity coming into the business. Again, really, this slide I've mostly hit on these particular bullet points, so I don't need to go any deeper into here. But there's downside too, right? You now bring in another owner into the business. They want to get into control potentially the decisions you've always made, just the docs and themselves in a boardroom. You've got another partner. You've given up some ownership along the way, so not right for everyone. But it is interesting. It's creating a legitimate third option, which, if nothing else, even if it's not of interest to a particular orthopedic group, it probably helps with leverage if you're looking at doing something with a management company or with a hospital from a pure valuation standpoint. Is there is another a third and very legitimate and viable option for these high profile groups. And just finally, just to give an example, most recently Rothman Orthopedic Institute, New Health, and Move Health. It's actually not a private equity deal, but it's an interesting deal, and it's a joint venture where they've all come together, a management company, a developer of centers, and an orthopedic group to joint venture and kind of bring the best of those, the different features of the different organizations together to really create some growth and scale. You see Frazier, which is a well-respected private equity firm in Seattle, and Princeton Ventures on the East Coast, and that's invested in the Core Institute, Varsity Healthcare Partners, the Orthopedic Institute, Candescent, Southeastern Spine. So you're seeing Atlantic Street Capital and Ortho Bethesda, for example. So you're seeing big, prominent groups starting to look a little bit outside of the box in terms of who's the right organization to partner with, to build the business with, and it's kind of changing the landscape again in an interesting way. And I think you're going to start to see more and more consolidation and some really larger groups instead of it just being regional, where these guys dominate North Carolina, these guys dominate, in New York. Now you're going to get into some cross-pollination there and consolidation. So again, just a really interesting change in the landscape, driven fundamentally by the really, really positive characteristics of orthopedics, and total joints really one of the big drivers of that. So with that, that sort of concludes the core presentation part. Brian, I don't know if you wanted to kind of open it up to Q&A. I think we have a little bit of time for that.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you, Nader, for that fantastic presentation. So we'll now begin today's question and answer session. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your dashboard, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. The first question here I'm going to go with, this attendee asks, if an orthopedic group or ASC is looking at a private equity investment, what is a realistic valuation, and what are the main factors that go into that valuation?
So I addressed this a little bit in the presentation. I would say if you go outside of orthopedics for a second and look at other specialties that have done deals along these lines, I would say 6 to 8 times EBITDA is a pretty reasonable range. 8 is a good deal, on the upper side. I would say 6 to 7, the majority of the deals in that range. That said, I think that orthopedic groups are in very high demand right now, and I do think that the overarching, again, growth and margin profile and opportunity for consolidation, it's new in the industry. If you've got a good group with a good sort of core management team, dominating a market, et cetera, I think that 10, 11 times is not out of range at all for these kinds of businesses. So, and the other thing to factor in there is, where are you today, and what are you looking to, what are your numbers projected over the next 12 months? How real are those? How many of those initiatives are in place? Because in a perfect world, you can negotiate that EBITDA multiple off of your forward number, or by forward, I mean the projected number for the year as opposed to your last 12 months. And so that can even make the number go higher when you look at it on a traditional kind of trailing 12-month basis.
Thank you. That's helpful to understand. And so the next question we're going to take here is, how often do you see centers that are designed to do not only total joint replacements as opposed to all orthopedic centers or multi-specialty centers?
So that's actually a really interesting question. I would say it's really all over the board. I would say historically we've seen orthopedics done in a multi-specialty environment, and it's starting to move where you're seeing orthopedic only centers, and then you're seeing, for example, these kinds of deals like Rothman with Move and New Health, where they're going to look to build not just orthopedic only, but there may be sports medicine only, or you're starting to see total joint only centers as well. And so a lot of our clients, as we end up in conversations with them, are evaluating those different scenarios. Do they have enough volume? What would the numbers look like? How do they project what they're going to get paid? What is Medicare going to look like from a payment standpoint? So there's a lot of uncertainty as you build something that specific. But at the same time, if you can focus that, have your capital dollars invested in, doing one thing, it's great. If you think about it from a patient standpoint, patient can say, I can go there. This is all they do are total joints. So there definitely those exist around the country now in smaller volume. But I think these more specialized centers are coming, and I think coming pretty fast.
Thank you. And so the next question here, I believe, is in reference to the total joint program revenues and gross profit slide. And the attendee asked, does the $6,782 case cost include physical therapy and anesthesia?
No. So that would be sort of a non-bundled way of looking at it. That's just a surgery center looking at their actual facility costs there. So PT, anesthesia, those other things would be outside of that. But their reimbursement that we were looking at was also out, excluding those things. That was just talking about reimbursement for the facility. When we talked, the 18,000 or 22,000 or 15,000 numbers, we were looking at that as a revenue or reimbursement to the facility and the actual expenses of the facility as an entity. So that these would be separate.
Excellent. Thanks for clarifying that. And we've got just a couple minutes left, so maybe one or two more questions. This attendee would like to know, what is the average reimbursement on TKA for an ASC that has not negotiated a carve-out for joints?
So, one of the things I mentioned in there, and I had a slide that showed such a wide range of numbers. There's so many factors to consider, heavy of which is, geographically where are you located? What does your competitive landscape look like? Are there 5 surgery centers within 10 miles and they're all already in network and have contracts at X? You're going to be sort of capped at a certain number. So with all that said, I would say, including, implants, if I had to pick a range, I'd probably say, 12 to 18,000. It's a wide range, but I would say that's probably 12's on the low side, so maybe 14 to 18. That's including the implant.
Excellent. Helpful to know. And we're at time, so Nader, do you have any final thoughts for our attendees today?
No, just as I mentioned, if there are other questions that people have, I don't know if you can send them to me, or if people have any, my email. Happy if you guys give that out. They can shoot me a note and ask any follow-up questions. Happy to answer.
Great. Yeah, we'll definitely facilitate communication on our end. We'll do what we can. And so that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank Nader for his excellent presentation and National Medical Billing Services for sponsoring today's webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.
Thanks, everyone.